as possible.
Thank you. Before we come to First Minister's questions, members will wish to join me in welcoming to the gallery the Speaker of the National Assembly of Guyana, the Honourable Raphael Trotman MP. Question number 1, Joanne Lamont.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And in welcoming the First Minister back to his place, can I ask him what engagements is planned for the rest of the day?
First Minister.
I've written, Presiding Officer, to the Government and the President of the United States expressing the sympathy and solidarity of Scotland in relation to the extraordinary weather conditions which have engulfed the eastern seaboard. And later today I'll have meetings to take forward the Government's programmes for Scotland.
Joanne Lamont.
And I'm sure in that letter our sensibilities and sympathies go to the people of America in these difficult times. Last week, the Deputy First Minister's spokesman said there was a cast iron position that an independent Scotland would retain the pound. I congratulate the First Minister on gaining such unequivocal agreement. Can I ask when this agreement with the Treasury and the Bank of England was reached, when and where was it signed, and when did negotiations start?
First Minister.
Well, I'm sure that even Joanne Lamont's heard that the Secretary of State for Scotland pointed out that there was no legal bar on Scotland having sterling as its currency. And the proposition that we put forward for a sterling zone is an extremely reasonable one. I'm not certain of what the Labour Party's position in terms of the currency of an independent Scotland should be, but we think it suits the interests of Scotland and suits the interests of the rest of the UK to have a sterling zone. In terms of Scotland's interest, there's the argument for continuity of the sterling position. In terms of both our interests, it's what would be called an optimal currency area in terms of the productivity of both currencies. It's not my description. It's the description of the Institute of Fiscal Studies. And lastly, the question as to why it would be in the interest of the rest of the UK, well, of course, revenues from Scotland's resources would come to Scotland, but in terms of the protection to the balance of payments, it would afford some £40 billion sterling protection to the balance of payments of the sterling zone. I think they'd be biting our hands off for Scotland to retain that sterling membership.
Joanne Lamont.
Well, in the First Minister's own words, that was a very, very convincing response in terms of the debate. Because there's not a legal bar to a lot of things, but that's a different point altogether from a cast iron guarantee. Hope, expectation, it would all be great if they could just agree with it, is not the same as a cast iron guarantee. Surely even the First Minister understands that. So let me recap. According to the First Minister, we'll be in the EU without having to reply, and we know that without asking any other member state or anyone for legal advice. We know we won't have to have the euro, and we don't need to ask about that either. And we'll keep the pound, and we don't need to ask anyone about that too. Can I ask the First Minister, without looking at the long-range forecast, what will the weather be like in an independent Scotland?
First Minister.
I wonder,
Order. First Minister.
in the interests of a serious debate on the issue, has Joanne Lamont managed to cast her eye over the evidence of Grain Avery to the House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee? She'll recall that Grain Avery is a senior member of St Andrews College, Oxford, senior advisor to the European Policy Centre and honorary Director General of the European Commission. He points out that Scotland's 5 million people, having been members of the European Union for 40 years, have acquired rights as European citizens. For practical and political reasons, they could not be asked to leave the EU and apply for readmission. Now, I know this is very inconvenient for the political weather facing the Labour Party, but it does rather put the lie to the scaremongering campaign of Labour and their unionist colleagues in the Conservative Party.
Joanne Lamont.
You know, in the interest of a serious debate, the First Minister ought to stop finding somebody that he alleges agree with them and quoting him in this place. There are a lot of different positions in this, including that, of course, of his own backbencher, John Mason, who said on Tuesday that these things are not definite. They are all open to negotiation. The First Minister, the charge is at his door is that he asserts things for which he has no evidence. And it is about time that the First Minister got serious about the future of Scotland. It's the First Minister who thinks he can treat the people of Scotland like fools, who thinks we'll believe everything he says, when after last week no one trusts a word he says. I understand why he didn't turn up to Tuesday's debate to defend his reputation, because even he knows he no longer has a reputation to defend. What is it that he's so scared of that he can't ask the Bank of England about the pound, he can't ask other EU members about Europe, or is it just he simply can't face the truth when he is presented with it?
First Minister.
On the question of sterling, can John Lamont remember that we set up a fiscal commission with two Nobel laureates in economics who are pursuing that matter, which seems to me a pretty serious contribution to the debate. In terms of Graham Avery, I've read out his credentials. I suspect he knows, given he's an honorary Director General of the European Union, he knows rather more about these issues even than Joanne Lamont. In terms of the trust and the serious debate which Joanne Lamont thinks she wants to argue for, can I just point out that these matters have been tested. I'm not just talking about in the Scottish elections last year, but in the social attitude survey, which tests the trust in the Scottish Government against the trust in the UK Government. That's running at 64% to 24%. And then, of course, the question asked by YouGov just last week, about who's best standing up for Scotland. Who do people trust to stand up for Scotland? Joanne Lamont's figure was 6%. So, on behalf of the other 94% of the people of Scotland, can I say the reason that people don't trust the Labour Party in Scotland is he stood on a manifesto commitment to defend the freeze on the council tax, to defend free tuition, to defend free prescriptions and a free health service, and Joanne Lamont's in the middle of tearing up every single one of these commitments. The first political party in history to betray its commitments when it's in opposition, an extraordinary achievement from the Labour Party. So if the Labour Party wants to regain the trust of the people, then why not have that debate on the issues facing this country? And why not acknowledge that oil-rich, gas-rich, energy-rich Scotland, fishing-rich Scotland will be welcomed with open arms in the European Union?
Joanne Lamont.
In the debate about Scotland's future, I stand with Campbell Christie in saying in tough times you look at competing good demands and make sure that those of us with the broadest shoulders are the ones that take the heaviest burden. And he says he's setting up his fiscal group. But surely it would have been an idea to pursue the matter of whether we're going to have the pound or not with the Bank of England and the Treasury. They will be the people that will decide that matter. But of course, the First Minister has long sought international profile. And my goodness, he's got it. The Washington Post, the newspaper that exposed...
Order!
You may have read it. The Washington Post, the newspaper that exposed Richard Nixon's corruption, knows a chancer when it sees one. And it makes a serious charge.
Order! Order!
The Washington Post said, Mr Salmons, I'm sure you've read it, but would like to share it with others. Mr Salmons' cheerful assurances that Scotland could quickly join the European Union while retaining the British pound as its currency remain to be tested. London would have a veto over both. EU states might demand that Scotland commit to the wobbly euro. If the pound were split between two nations, it could become subject to the same troubles that have afflicted the European currency. These are serious matters being addressed by serious people. If the Post can see that from Washington, why can't the First Minister see that from here?
First Minister.
Well, as those who have read the Washington Post editorial, they'll realise it made almost as many mistakes as Joanne Lamont made, in points of fact, in the week. But I actually welcome the contribution of newspapers in the United States of America to the Scottish political debate. And the Washington Post is not alone. The Los Angeles Times on October the 22nd. Arguably the most important difference would be that an independent Scotland would be master of its own economy and natural resources. I very much agree with that. Then there's the Wall Street Journal, and I think this quote will be particularly apposite for Joanne Lamont. All too often this debate rarely gets past the sneering view that Scotland would be too poor or too small to stand on its own 2 feet outside the UK. But the claim that Scotland is a subsidy junkie has already been proved a myth. New accounts of revenue and expenditure from the Treasury data show Scotland rarely gives more than it receives from the UK coffers. You know, if that is known and understood to the Wall Street Journal, why hasn't the news reached the Labour Party in Scotland? But can I say to Joanne Lamont, I'm absolutely fascinated by the approach to the serious political debate. And you know, a year is a kind of a time in Joanne Lamont's leadership, because I came across an article, actually an interview she did with The Guardian just a year ago, when she talked about her great frustration. Her great frustration. I'm more frustrated by the politics where you play the man and not the politics. I think after a few weeks, when Joanne Lamont has managed to call me stupid, weak, a sucker, devious and a corkscrew, I think after that, comparing with the interview, no wonder nobody believes a word she says.
Question number 2, Ruth Davidson. Ms Davidson, order. Order, Ms Davidson.
To ask the First Minister when he will next meet the Secretary of State for Scotland.
First Minister.
No plans, near future.
Ms Davidson.
I'd like to say that it's nice to see the First Minister back in his chair in the Chamber. When he ducked out on Tuesday of that debate, a debate about his conduct, he avoided a sadly very necessary reminder that the nation needs trust when it comes to every aspect of his independence plans. We know now he has no legal basis for his claims about Scotland's place in Europe. And as for the economy, I'll just repeat what the head of Scottish Financial Enterprise told a Lords Committee last week, which was another appointment that the First Minister ducked. Owen Kelly said of the Scottish Government, "It is aimed at persuading rather than providing an authoritative conclusion. I struggle to see how they have the authority to tell us anything." So that's Europe, that's the economy. What about defence? This First Minister says an independent Scotland can be a fully committed member of NATO, but kick the nuclear submarine fleet out of Faslane. Can he tell us what facts or advice he has sought or received to support this assertion?
First Minister.
Well, you'll find the question of NATO membership in Scotland published in the constitutional documents and also in the policy positions of the Scottish National Party. The argument for how a non-nuclear state can be a member of NATO surely is evidenced by the fact that 25 out of the 28 member countries of NATO are non-nuclear at the present moment. So we have the kind of fact in existence that 25 such countries exist at the present moment. But I was extremely interested by the interview of Philip Hammond, I think earlier this week in Good Morning Scotland, where in the space of one interview, actually in the space of one question, firstly he said he had no contingency plans on the fact of oncoming independent Scotland. And then in the same thing he said they had contingency plans for every eventuality. So I suspect that Ruth Davidson should use her extraordinary influence with the Conservative Party to actually follow the recommendations of the House of Commons Select Committee and suggest to Philip Hammond and the rest of the UK government, it would be very wise indeed to have these contingency plans, because I believe, as a majority of this chamber does, that Scotland will vote for independence in 2 years' time, and that nuclear weapons are on their way out of Scotland.
Ms Davidson. Order.
So his answer on evidence for an SNP policy is to look at an SNP policy document. Brilliant. It goes further than the non-answer we got on Tuesday from his deputy leader. And also, I wrote to the First Minister about this issue, you may remember. It was all about the legal position in relation to NATO. And what I got back was a letter from a junior official saying that all will be revealed in 2013. And wait for it, it will all be fully in accordance with the legal advice received by Scottish ministers. So we know what that means. So I asked the Ministry of Defence what discussions had taken place with the Scottish Government, what work has gone on to stand this up. The answer? None. No contact between the Scottish Government and the MOD. No facts to support Mr Salmon's claims. And it's not just the Conservatives that have noticed. Look behind you, First Minister. Jamie Hepburn. It is nigh on impossible to remove nuclear weapons under pressure from NATO. Sandra White. It is hypocritical to be anti-nuclear and pro-NATO. And perhaps it was Councillor Norman MacLeod who summed up SNP policy the best when he said that this and so other issues, it goes into unsubstantiated assertion. Councillor MacLeod, the nation owes you a debt of gratitude for summing up what we already know. Even his own side recognises that this First Minister asserts as facts things he does not know to be true. Now, we know we can't trust him on defence, we know we can't trust him on the economy, and we certainly can't trust him on Europe. How can Scotland trust him on anything ever again?
First Minister.
Right, OK. The Select Committee on Scottish Affairs, I don't agree, incidentally, with any of the types of politics of the members who contrives the report, but she will recall just a few days ago the Select Committee on Scottish Affairs concluded that, of course, it would be possible to remove nuclear weapons from Scotland, and that committee includes a number of Conservative members. Obviously, it can't include any Conservative members from Scotland because there are none outside government at the present moment. That was the conclusion. My evidence was that 25 out of 28 NATO member countries are non-nuclear. That seems to be pretty convincing evidence. As far as divisions in a party are concerned, I don't think Ruth Davidson is in a splendid position to comment on that at the present moment. The preference is that this party has open debate at its annual conference. What happens to the Conservative Party is there's a group of about 50 MPs intent on bringing down their government at Westminster and seem to be doing a splendid job. On Tuesday, of course, I was giving a speech on renewable policy to the UK Renewables Conference. At the same time, John Hayes, the UK Minister, gave a speech which he then didn't give, which was then leaked to the Telegraph and the Mail, which was then contradicted by his boss at 10:30 yesterday morning and by the Prime Minister's questions. And today his predecessor has entered the debate disagreeing with his successor. I think in the context of the chaos and confusion on Tuesday on UK energy policy, I think the policy of the Scottish National Party looks pretty firm and pretty consistent. And lastly, on the question of trust, I mentioned the 6% who believe that Joanne Lamont stands up for Scottish interests. Ruth Davidson, you're up there challenging. It was 5% for you.
We have a constituency question. Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the First Minister aware that the RMT Union is balloting the crews that serve on the Orkney and Shetland ferry service at this time, that we potentially face in the islands industrial action over the Christmas holiday period, that would have a devastating impact on families and students returning home for Christmas, on the goods and perishable products that need to move into the islands, and particularly on the salmons, mussels and whitefish that is exported from the islands at that key time for those industries. Will he undertake to ensure the government looks into this issue, make sure that a strike does not happen, and that we can look forward to Christmas without disruption at this time?
First Minister.
Well, the government is aware of the the possibility of industrial action, and will be doing its utmost to avoid industrial action which would severely inconvenience people in the Northern Islands. I would say to Tavish Scott, of course, that the RMT have balloted industrial action in a number of times in recent times, and many of these disputes have been settled. And I'm sure this whole chamber believes and hopes that this dispute will be settled as well.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what discussions the Scottish Government has had with the National Museum Scotland regarding the potential closure of the National Museum of Costume, which is so vital to the local economy of Dumfries and Galloway in my region, and also is part of a very strong network of tourism infrastructure down there and would be a really serious loss to the local economy.
First Minister.
Well, I'm aware of the issue, and can I undertake that Fiona Hislop, the Cultural Secretary, will contact the member, and if she seeks a meeting, that meeting will be granted, so the issue can be discussed in substantial detail.
Question number 3, Willie Rennie.
To ask the First Minister what issues will be discussed at the next meeting of the Cabinet.
First Minister.
Issues of importance to the people of Scotland.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister and I can agree that it would be unlikely an independent Scotland would be excluded from the European Union. I'm afraid we missed the point. The question is the terms. So has he secured any agreements with the 27 countries of the European Union to show that they will approve his detailed terms for Scotland's place in Europe?
First Minister.
Well, I don't know if Willie Rennie's caught up with the news today that I shouldn't call it his government, but of course it's a government he supports at Westminster, has just confirmed that they are not going to take up the European Commission's offer for the European Commission's advice on this matter. So it does put them in a kind of strange position as far as the clarity is concerned. But I referred to Jan Lamont, Graham Avery's paper a few seconds ago. I think I should refer Willie Rennie to it as well. Particularly, I think, the second last sentence. Such solutions would, in fact, be in Scotland's interest, since it could expect to obtain a better deal as a member state with a full voice and vote in the European Union than in the pre-independence period. That seems to me, from an independent academic, a pretty strong statement of our belief that Scotland would be better as a member state of the European Union than a subsidiary part of a state which, as I see from various events within the coalition government, it doesn't seem to be particularly enthusiastic about European Union membership at the present moment.
Willie Rennie.
The First Minister would have to get the agreement from 27 countries, not just the opinion of the European Commission. And Mr Avery said that Scotland's terms of membership would be the subject to agreement with the 27 other governments. So it's hard to believe that the First Minister doesn't have one single agreement. He clearly thinks all 27 will just sign up to whatever he wants. This is not just about the specific legal advice he asked for or not, or the academic opinion he prefers to cite or ignores. This is about the politics, the domestic politics of other countries too. The First Minister might not like this, but other people now doubt what he says. And they want to know for sure what they might lose before they vote in any referendum. So, as he has no agreements with other countries yet, when does he expect to get them? Or will it be vote first and ask questions later?
First Minister.
I really do suggest that he pays more attention to reading the paper from Graham Avery. The key points it makes is that Scotland's position will be negotiated from within the European Union. He also goes on to express the view that I've read out to Willie Rennie, that would be a rather better position as an independent state than we have at the present moment. Why is that important in terms of this debate? Well, it rather gives the lie in a counterbalance to the arguments of people who I'm sure Willie Rennie wouldn't want to follow, since he says he was absolutely sure that Scotland would become a member of the European Union. But wasn't it Lord Wallace just a few weeks ago who was openly speculating on Scotland being shunned and put out of the European Union? So once the Liberal Democrats can get a consistent policy between their few members in Scotland, then perhaps they should come to the Chamber. We're in a situation at the present moment where I think, and this is a fairly modest assertion, that there is a good deal of uncertainty over the UK's membership of the European Union. Why is there a good deal of uncertainty? Because the partners in the UK coalition have a sizable group of people who want to leave the European Union. Now, given that Willie Rennie is part of a party which is in government with a great deal of people and perhaps even cabinet ministers who want to leave the European Union, then I don't think he's in a good position to come to this chamber and lecture us on our European credentials. Scotland's a European nation. We intend to stay a European nation. Resource-rich, energy-rich, oil-rich Scotland will be welcomed in Europe. And given I've mentioned to the other two political leaders, I can hardly resist telling Willie Rennie that while Joanne Lamont got 6%, Ruth Davison 5%, his total was 2% of the Scottish population.
Question number 4, Christina McKelvey.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what the economic benefits for Scotland are of replacing Trident.
First Minister.
Well, Scottish taxpayers currently pay £163 million a year towards the running of Trident. That money could be spent on 3,880 nurses, 4,527 teachers, or a host of new schools and hospitals in our community. And that's even before we consider the extra £84 million a year that's proposed we spend on the replacement over the next 15 years. This week we've had the UK Defence Secretary coming up to Scotland saying he hasn't even considered the people of Scotland who vote yes in 2014, and he plans to foist on this country nuclear weapons over the next 50 years, the next half a century. I think the arrogance of that kind is very typical of Tory ministers who believe they can continue to treat this country as a nuclear dump. I think they're not on.
Christina McKelvey.
Can I thank the First Minister for that very interesting response, but would he agree?
Order.
Would he agree it is incumbent on all political leaders in Scotland to make their position known? Yesterday, the Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament criticised the Labour leader Joanne Lamont for consistently failing to publicise her views on Trident. This was after one of her own frontbenchers, Neil Findlay, claimed that renewal was economically incompetent. Unlike the Labour Party, I believe the Scottish Government's position on this is crystal clear. Will the First Minister reiterate that position in the hope that the majority of members in this chamber could speak out and resist the development and the dumping of nuclear arms in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, not just the Scottish Government, but a majority of this chamber have voted to get Trident out of Scotland. That opinion is shared across Civic Scotland by the churches, the STUC and civil society who oppose Trident. And as far as the UK Minister's determination to foist nuclear weapons on Scotland over the next 50 years, can I point out, as I understand it, although these things are a never-moving feast, that policy is not even supported by the other half of the Westminster coalition. So in a situation where this government, a majority of this Parliament, a majority of the Scottish people, Scottish civic society do not want to see nuclear weapons renewed in Scotland, can we not declare as a people and as a nation that enough is enough and we are not standing for it anymore?
Question number 5, Jackie Bailey.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the Audit Scotland report NHS Financial Performance 2011-12, which suggests real-term budget reductions and growing financial pressures on the NHS.
First Minister.
Well, the Scottish Government, as the member well knows, has protected spending in the National Health Service, has ensured there will be above real terms resource funding increases from in 2012 and 13 to 2014-15, just as we committed to in our manifesto. That's reflected in an average uplift to the territorial health boards of 3.3% in 2013-14, as compared to the current Treasury deflator of 2.5%. The Audit Scotland report, NHS Financial Performance, highlighted that the NHS broke even and said that the relatively small surpluses achieved by boards at the year-end highlights the careful management of the financial position.
Jack Bailey.
The First Minister's response reminded me of NHS Lothian's approach to waiting times, where there was a culture of strongly discouraging the reporting of bad news. I hope the First Minister will not continue to be in denial about the problems facing the NHS. Would you therefore agree that the cuts to nursing numbers of over 2,500 are having a direct impact not just on patient care but on nurses themselves? And today, in the Edinburgh Evening News, we find that 17,500 working days are lost amongst nurses alone due to stress in NHS Lothian, a record high. Is that not a wake-up call for the SNP and the First Minister?
First Minister.
Yes, and of course, Jackie Baillie also knows that sickness absence across the National Health Service is much lower than when Labour were in government. She also should know that on every indicator, the National Health Service in Scotland is performing at record levels, which is a tribute to the nurses, to the doctors, to every single worker in our National Health Service. You know, Jackie Baillie says I'm not a purveyor of bad news, and I think that's probably true, but she could never claim that title for herself. I mean, it is after all less than a year ago since Jackie Baillie assured us in a press statement that Scotland was, quote, the superbug capital of Europe. Unfortunately for Jackie Baillie, it was then found out the statistics which she was relying on related to the period of Labour in government in Scotland. Now, I don't know, and I'm open to correction on this, if Jackie Baillie has ever had the grace and the courtesy to apologise for that slight on the National Health Service. Well, you know, I'm just quoting the superbug capital of Europe. The statistics are based on a survey of 2007 when Labour Party were in government. Clearly a major mistake from Jackie Baillie, but surely evidence from my contention that Jackie Baillie and bad news are never far separated.
Question number 6, Nigel Don.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister what progress has been made to ensure equal pay by employers subject to its public sector pay policy.
First Minister.
Well, we're committed to ensuring pay systems in the public sector are fair and non-discriminatory. Scotland has a strong record in this area. The gender pay gap is smaller and closing faster in Scotland than the rest of the UK. However, the gap still exists. I don't think that's acceptable, and we will continue to work with key partners to address the issue.
Nigel Don.
I'm grateful to the First Minister for his comments about protecting household incomes through equal pay and social wage within public sector pay policy. I note a letter in the Sunday Herald a few weeks back from Bob Holman, one of the Labour Party's renowned anti-poverty campaigners, who considered that universal services were also an essential part of Labour policy. Does the First Minister share my surprise that it seems that the SNP is now the only major political party which maintains this view?
First Minister.
Well, that's certainly correct. Of course, these services were considered vital in the Labour Party manifesto last year when Joanne Lamont was Deputy Leader of the party, but now are to be sacrificed in the new Labour policy review. I think the social wage is an important concept. I think also the living wage is an important concept. The living wage helps us close the gender gap in pay, and the social wage is part of a social contract with society, that in these tough times that people can see the government's doing their best to help them on things like the council tax, prescription charges and free tuition. I would have hoped that that would carry the vast majority of this chamber. I think the Labour Party and Joanne Lamont will find out to their cost that desertion, not of their manifesto, but desertion of these key principles will cost the Labour Party dear in Scottish politics in times to come.
That ends First Minister's question. We now move to members' business. Members who are leaving the chamber should do so quickly and quietly, and any members who are leaving the gallery should hasten and keep the noise levels down. Thank you.